Long before headlines screamed his name and bullets sealed his fate, Lolly Jackson was just George Luca's ticket into the underworld, and a curious icon of South Africa's post-apartheid capitalist fever dream. Born in Cyprus and raised in South Africa, Jackson didn't seem destined for infamy. He wasn't the slick gangster archetype, nor a seasoned underworld tactician. But he was ambitious, eccentric, and obsessed with money, status, and beautiful women. By the late 1990s, Jackson had found his golden goose: strip clubs. This was before your cheeky tigers. In 1999, he launched Teazers, a brand that would soon become synonymous with risque glamour and moral controversy. It wasn't just a strip club, it was a franchise, a brand, a spectacle. Jackson capitalized on South Africa's shifting cultural climate, offering the illusion of Western-style liberation, even as the country struggled with poverty, inequality, and crime. But behind the Teazers billboards and catchy slogans lay a much darker world. Jackson's fortune didn't flow from lap dances alone. Investigators and insiders would later allege that Teazers was a laundering front, a place where money and people moved with little oversight. Jackson flaunted his wealth and courted the media, often bragging about his Ferrari collection and love for high-stakes living. But such attention came at a price. As Teazers grew, so did Jackson's list of enemies, and his web of dangerous connections. Enter Radovan Krejcir, a Czech fugitive with ties to international organized crime. Krejcir arrived in South Africa in 2007, reportedly on the run from money laundering and murder charges. He found sanctuary and opportunity in a country with porous systems and officials ripe for manipulation. And soon, he found Jackson. The two men were drawn to each other like gasoline and fire. Krejcir wanted access to cash-rich businesses that could help him wash his illicit millions. Jackson, by now deep in financial trouble with SARS, saw Krejcir as a lifeline, or perhaps a threat he couldn't afford to ignore. By 2009, Jackson's empire was buckling under SARS scrutiny. He owed millions in unpaid taxes and was under pressure to sell his franchise. Whispers began to swirl: drug trafficking, human trafficking, links to the Albanian and Serbian underworlds. Jackson denied everything, but the walls were closing in, and in the shadows, a Cypriot associate named George Luca, also known as George Smith, waited, watching. Jackson's life, once dripping in opulence, was descending into paranoia. He confided in friends that he was being followed, that Krejcir was blackmailing him, that the people he once called allies were now circling like vultures. He was right. On the night of May 3, 2010, Lolly Jackson walked into a house in Edleen Kempton Park, owned by George Luca. What happened next would ignite a storm of conspiracy, betrayal, and murder.
Well, they shared a cell together in prison. They were at Modderby, and Krejcir was awaiting an extradition hearing. And nobody knew that George Smith was actually George Luca, but George Luca at that time was masquerading as George Smith, and he had an ID book. I've got a copy of the ID book. And he was allegedly a South African, but I mean, the minute he opens his mouth, you know he's not a South African.
The evening of May 3, 2010, began like many others in Lolly Jackson's chaotic, high-stakes world, with promises, half-truths, and a meeting that felt more like a summons. By then, Jackson was juggling tax cases, business implosions, and a relationship with Radovan Krejcir that had gone from opportunistic to ominous. And yet, he walked into a trap, voluntarily. Jackson met George Luca at a safe house in Edleen Kempton Park. Luca, a fellow Cypriot with his own checkered past, was known to police and underworld figures alike. At first glance, he seemed like a small-time hustler. In reality, Luca was deeply embedded in Krejcir's network, allegedly acting as a middleman, fixer, and, if whispers were true, a cleaner. What exactly happened inside that house is still contested, but what is known is this: Lolly Jackson was shot multiple times, at least 8 rounds fired at close range. He died almost instantly. His body slumped in a pool of blood on the floor of a suburban home, far from the VIP lounges and velvet ropes he was accustomed to. Within hours, the police received a bizarre call. George Luca, speaking in a panicked voice, contacted a police officer and allegedly confessed to the killing. He claimed Jackson had provoked him, insulted his wife, and even threatened his life. But even in that early confession, there were inconsistencies. Luca fled before officers could reach him, vanishing into the Johannesburg night. Initial reports suggested that the murder may have been a spontaneous crime of passion. But as investigators dug deeper, the theory began to unravel. Luca didn't just flee the scene, he left the country. With the help of fake documents and shadowy allies, he boarded a flight to Cyprus, where South African extradition efforts would be tangled in years of diplomatic red tape. Meanwhile, back in South Africa, the fallout was immediate. Krejcir publicly denied involvement, even as he continued to build his empire. The Teazers business crumbled. Jackson's family, devastated and paranoid, spoke to the press in cryptic tones, hinting at extortion, death threats, and deeper criminal syndicates. SARS escalated its investigation into Teazers. Assets were frozen, properties raided, employees disappeared into silence. South Africa's media dubbed it a gangland hit. Rumors surged. Jackson had tried to blackmail Krejcir. He had threatened to go to the authorities. He had stumbled into a trafficking ring. Each theory was darker than the last. As years passed, Luca became the most wanted man connected to the crime, but his silence was deafening. From Cyprus, he issued sporadic statements, sometimes denying the murder, other times claiming he had damning evidence that would expose Krejcir and others. He hinted at a conspiracy, saying he was merely the fall guy in a much larger orchestrated plot. But the truth remained locked inside Luca, and Jackson was buried with more questions than answers. The murder of Lolly Jackson wasn't just a hit, it was the beginning of an unraveling, one that would expose a network of assassinations, foreign crime lords, and a South African underworld spinning out of control.
No, I don't believe he shot Lolly Jackson. I have my own theory about what happened that night, and that theory does not include George Luca pulling the trigger. I believe he was present, and I believe others were present. I know for a fact that Cyril Beaker was there, and so was General Mabasa. So I think what we'd like now is to hear firsthand from the horse's mouth as to exactly what did transpire that night.
For nearly 3 years, George Luca remained a ghost, hiding in plain sight in Cyprus, shielded by a tangled mess of legal and political red tape. South African authorities pushed for extradition, journalists tried to track him down, and all the while whispers of what Luca knew, what he could reveal, began to grow louder than the official investigation. In 2012, the first real crack appeared. Luca, now under mounting pressure from both the South African government and Cypriot law enforcement, began to speak. In a televised interview with Enka, Luca dropped a bombshell. He didn't kill Lolly Jackson. He claimed Radovan Krejcir did. According to Luca, he had merely taken the fall. He said Krejcir shot Lolly right in front of him. He told him to clean it up, to make it disappear. He described how Krejcir had lured Jackson to the house in Kempton Park. The two men had argued over money, possibly over laundering deals gone bad. When tempers flared, Krejcir allegedly pulled the trigger. Luca claimed he was then forced to call the police and claim responsibility, under threat to his life and family. If Luca was telling the truth, then South Africa's criminal justice system had not only let the wrong man flee the country, but was also harboring a known gangster who had potentially ordered or committed multiple murders. But even as Luca made his claims, Krejcir remained untouched, moving freely, flaunting his wealth, and allegedly expanding his criminal enterprise. Krejcir had long cultivated the image of a legitimate businessman, but behind the scenes, intelligence reports and court dockets painted a different picture. He was tied to everything from drug trafficking and money laundering to contract killings. Several figures in his orbit, business partners, bodyguards, even a forensic investigator, were turning up dead. The pattern was chilling. People who crossed Krejcir seemed to vanish or die in sudden violent ways. And then, in 2013, the tables turned. South African police, after years of surveillance and mounting evidence, raided Krejcir's Bedfordview compound. Krejcir was arrested, along with several accomplices. Still, the Luca Jackson connection remained unresolved. By the time Luca was finally extradited to South Africa in 2014, his health had deteriorated. He was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer. Gaunt, coughing, and wheeled into court under heavy guard, He looked like a man racing against death. And yet, even then, Luca teased the truth. In affidavits and jailhouse interviews, he reiterated that he wasn't the shooter. He hinted at police complicity, corrupt prosecutors, and a bigger picture he couldn't yet expose.
And considerably thinner George Luca. He's awaiting trial on murder and theft charges, but has promised to return to South Africa if his health allows. Luca denies killing Lolly Jackson and has finally shed some light on the night of the murder. He has pointed the finger of blame at alleged mafia boss Radovan Krejcir, whom he says apparently owed Jackson a large sum of money. Luca says Jackson began swearing at Krejcir and pushed him.
You don't know, mother who I am.
You don't know, mother who I am.
Lolly said to Radovan.
Lolly said to Radovan.
At that time, Lolly, Radovan.
Sorry, Radovan.
He put the gun.
He put the gun.
And he shot him.
He shot him.
Krejcir then allegedly shot Jackson several more times before asking for help to dispose of the body. Luca refused and fled the country soon after. The state spent 3 years and millions of rand to have Luca extradited. But even though he's been in custody since 2013, it appears the state is nowhere near ready to prosecute him.
On June 20th, 2015, George Luca died in Kalafong Hospital under police guard without ever testifying in court. He took his secrets with him, and with that, the final witness to Lolly Jackson's murder was gone. Despite Krejcir being jailed in a separate case, ultimately convicted for attempted murder, kidnapping, and drug-related charges, the Jackson case remained technically unresolved. No one was ever convicted for the murder. The South African justice system had once again been outmaneuvered by a maze of fear, loyalty, and silence. By 2011, the fallout from Lolly Jackson's assassination had spilled far beyond the strip club walls of Teazers. The empire was gone. Key players had either vanished or turned up dead, and the investigation into his murder had hit wall after wall of silence. But those closest to Jackson, those who had helped him build and protect his empire, were now targets themselves. Among them was Ian Jordan, Jackson's longtime lawyer and trusted confidant. Jordan had not only represented Jackson in his endless legal battles with SARS and other regulatory bodies, he had also been instrumental in helping manage Teazers' complex financial and legal web. According to sources, Jordan held knowledge about Jackson's business dealings, offshore structures, and most critically, connections to figures like Radovan Krejcir. On the morning of September 20th, 2011, Jordan vanished. He had gone to meet a client in Bruma, a busy commercial area in Johannesburg. Witnesses reported that he was approached and forcibly taken by several men. Later that same day, police discovered his body in the boot of his own BMW, parked on a quiet street in Boksburg. He had been shot multiple times. There was no sign of robbery. At the time of his death, Jordan was reportedly cooperating with authorities on sensitive matters relating to Jackson's multi-million rand estate, and possibly even elements of the Krejcir investigation. Some in law enforcement believe Jordan was preparing to hand over documents that could have helped untangle the financial and criminal network Jackson was enmeshed in before his death. His murder, much like Jackson's, stunned the public, but not the underworld.
News I can handle, and yes, the nightlife is going to increase, but one's got to be logical about it and think about it, and realistically people are going to come here, and for the first week they're not going to think of sex. After a week the guy's going to start thinking of sex, and it would be a big shame on South Africa if that guy went back HIV positive and he got it here in South Africa.